Hi there, Mrs. Gunter here. This is our second podcast of the year, and this one's going to be formatted a little bit more like what you're going to see in the future. It's going to look a little bit more like your packet page 4 right there in the middle. So you're going to be filling in this section of your notes. I'm going to have my slides going through that same information. It's not going to look exactly like that. I'm going to make a little bit more space, but I am going to go through it sequentially and talk about each of these things. So let's get started. So, what is the scientific method? You've probably heard those words before and probably used it in your other science classes. In our class, the way that we're going to be using it and apply it is that it is a systematic approach used in scientific study. And the key word there is systematic, because no matter what, we're going to be organized and go through a process the same way over and over again. So it's predictable and repeatable above all else. Now, we do use the scientific method in all sciences, no matter what science class you take in high school, whatever fancy sciences you go on to in college, and you probably even use the scientific method occasionally outside of your science class, because it is really just an organized approach to solving a problem or answering a question or something. So think about it as you're working in other classes or doing things outside of school even. Think about the process that we use in science and see the kind of similarities there. So you might also call this an organized process, and we do use it as scientists to do research and solve a lot of other problems as well. Now, you might have seen different steps in the scientific method on posters and such in your academic career, but in general, the scientific method is going to be started with a question, or you're going to see something. Maybe start with an observation. You see something and you wonder what's happening here, and that's when you ask a question. And from that question, you're going to have some kind of prediction, a hypothesis about what's happening or why. And from that prediction, we continue to test that prediction and those observations in an experiment. And hopefully from that experiment, we get some information out, and that data can lead us to answer the question and have a conclusion. And ideally, all of our scientific experiments and processes would go nice from observation to conclusion and be nice and linear and done. But oftentimes, once we collect that data, that leads us to question our prediction or change our prediction. And we go back and change that step, and then we retest and do another experiment and collect more data. And that might get us a conclusion, or we have to go back again, and we end up kind of going in a circle here over and over and over. And a lot of researchers can get stuck in this cycle where they're never really getting to the conclusion stage, but hopefully all experiments will end with a nice answer or conclusion. At least all of them in our class will. Sometimes people even get stuck and go back and change their initial question in the course of an experiment and research. So that can happen, and you will often see the scientific method represented by a cycle or a circle, but there is always going to be some kind of end to your investigations, especially in our class. So that's our process, but you notice everything kind of hinges on what happens here in this data step. What you get from that experiment is going to kind of determine whether you're done or whether you have to start over and change things. So let's talk about data real quick. There's two major types of data: qualitative data and quantitative data. And you might be able to figure out the difference between them just by bringing it back to those original words. Qualities go in qualitative data, and quantities go in quantitative. So if you think about qualities and qualitative data, that's the kind of data that's going to be descriptive information, usually words. And we're going to collect this type of data every single lab. You are always going to write down your observations, describe the color, odor, shape, or other physical characteristics. Really, when it comes down to it, this is when we're using our 5 senses, although you're probably not going to be using taste very often in our lab. You're going to be using your other senses in the lab for these qualitative data collections. Now, quantitative data is quantities, also known as numerical information. This is in numbers. We're going to put it in a data table. It tells you how much of something you have, how big, how small, etc. And we'll do more quantitative labs second semester once we can actually do a lot more of the calculations that go along with those numbers. So this first semester, we're really going to be dealing with what's happening, descriptive information. You're going to just be writing down observations. But don't worry, we'll get to those quantitative labs next semester. We'll get there eventually. Last couple of things, let's see. Hypothesis, maybe a little bit different than what you've heard before. A hypothesis in our class is going to be a tentative explanation for what's been observed. And we often actually don't necessarily write a hypothesis. We kind of work those into our labs as the purpose of the lab. It kind of says what we're going to do, what we're going to be explaining in that lab. So that's going to be it for us. Oftentimes it's going to be like an if-then statement. If I do this, then this will happen. Now, I'm going to skip over control for just a second because controls are part of the experiment, and so let's define experiment first. An experiment is not showing up. There we go. A set of controlled changes and observations that test the hypothesis. So once we make a hypothesis, that's when we do the experiment, and we need to make sure that we control the changes that are happening in that experiment and make sure that they are testing the hypothesis. We have to be very purposeful and careful with our experimental design. And just FYI, it's good to just change one thing at a time. You don't want to take one set of kind of conditions and then change everything about it. And if you see the results change, you won't know which one of those changes caused the results that you're seeing. So even if you want to change 10 things, it's a good idea to change one at a time. And that might mean you end up doing 10 experiments. So isolating and reducing those variables and changes that you have is a very important process for experiments and determining which are the important changes that need to happen. So, all that being said, a control is a standard used for comparison in an experiment. So before you make any major changes, this is the control. This is kind of the standard experiment. And if you think back to elementary school, you might have done that classic test of like, how does something affect plant growth? Like, how does sunlight affect plant growth? Or how does adding vinegar to the water affect plant growth? Well, for all of those experiments, when you're trying to test how vinegar affects plant growth, well, first you're going to have a plant that doesn't have vinegar in it in order to compare to the plants that do have vinegar so that you can actually see what that effect is. Without that standard control, you won't be able to see what that change or what that effect is. So those are really super important. And actually now kind of down below experiment, to answer the question, what's the function of the control in experiment? It's used to compare how changes affect an experiment. It's our baseline for what is happening in general so that we can see how our changes are going to affect our prediction and our hypothesis. So that's all of our definitions filled in there and a whole lot more information than you might have been expecting. There is one more question right underneath this. It says, give 2 examples of each qualitative and quantitative data that you collected from your bedroom. I don't actually really care if it's about your specific bedroom. What I need is 2 qualitative and 2 quantitative, and show me you know what they mean. Make sure you label them as qualitative and quantitative so I know you're not getting them mixed up. So I just want to see that you can kind of apply these 2 words to the surroundings and what you have going on around you right now. That's going to be one of the major things. I'm not writing them down for you, but I'm not going to give you a stamp if you don't have that last thing done in your packet. So make sure you get that done and filled in. Okay? I'll see you tomorrow, or I guess the next day maybe, and have a good night.